Um, I'd like to say a couple of things right at the beginning. First, thank you very much for inviting me to give this. Secondly, I want to emphasize that there are 3 co-directors on this project out there, me, York, Rowan, and Alex Wass. And what I'm going to be saying tonight, some of the interpretation is going to be me. And I'm not sure that they agree with what I'm going to be saying, but it's always good to go in there and kind of poke somebody in the chest once in a while with unfounded interpretations, perhaps. We began out in the Eastern Desert back in 2002, actually. Alex Wass and I did a survey in this area right here, but also down in southeastern Jordan, right on the Saudi border. When we came first up into the Black Desert, we went to Wasad pools. And at the time, the reason for our survey was to find late PPNB sites that may have been associated with a movement of domesticated goats and sheep into the Wadi into Saudi Arabia. And when we first went to Wasad pools, we just saw a whole bunch of bumps in the horizon and very little late PPNB. And it wasn't until we came back in 2008 that suddenly we saw all those bumps in the horizon were Neolithic sites, were Neolithic structures. And so we quickly changed our attitude and didn't have too much to do with looking for the late PPNB that barely existed out there anyway. We gave up that sort of migration of pastoralists into Saudi Arabia. One thing I should point out is that the earlier Neolithic in the Black Desert was barely visible. Were it not for the survey by Alison Betts, I think a lot of people would still say that there was no Neolithic out there. Most of what she had been doing back in the late 70s and throughout the 80s and early 90s was looking at a variety of small settlements. And I don't think the population for the entire Black Desert at that time was significantly high. I would say if it reached 1,000, that's 1,000 people for 15,000 square kilometers. That's probably an overestimate. But nevertheless, we do see population movements that may eventually have led to this hyper exploitation of the hyper arid desert. And it kind of starts out, I think, on the basis of a severe drop in precipitation back around the transition from the middle PPNB into the late PPNB. And when we look at the left side of this graph, which is by Bernie Benninger, you can see that at about 7,400 to 7,460, there was a sharp, I mean, suddenly dramatic drop in precipitation that may have lasted for 3 generations or more. And this may be responsible for an awful lot of the abandonment of middle PPNB sites in the Jordan Valley and in Israel itself. If we look at a map of the consequences of that drop, you can see on the left-hand side, these golden arrows represent what we think, both Hans-Georg Gabel and I, that this represents a migration of people from the lowlands in the valley and on the coastal plain up into Jordan and creating this, this cluster of megasites, either middle PPNB sites that suddenly doubled in population, or a megasite like down here at Basta, for example, that was created completely by itself, again, within a couple of generations. Well, if you go back now to that precipitation map again, there's another dramatic change in terms of climatic stability. The drop in rainfall wasn't as great, but it was certainly turbulent. It was very unstable. And I think this probably led to the collapse of the megasites. And the megasites themselves had already been threatening all of the local landscapes, all of the local social organization for that matter. Gable suspects that in Basta, the population reached 3,000 to 4,000. And I think the same is true at Ain Ghazal. And then we have these other large sites like Haraisin up in the northern part of Jordan that Basta and Ain Ghazal were 14 to 15 hectares in size, but then Haraisin shows up with 20 hectares. And so what keeps these people together as a single community probably was always on a very tentative basis. In any event, they do collapse, the megasites, and we see, first of all, a return of a lot of the population back to the Jordan Valley and into Israel again. But there's also a likely possibility that a considerable number of those, of the total population of those megasites, which may have reached 20,000 people just in that, in those 11 or 12 sites, a significant part may have moved into the Black Desert. Here we see that it's a very broad exposure here, about 15,000 square kilometers. The last volcanic explosion here is recorded as 500,000 years ago. It's been virtually quiet ever since. There may have been some occasional disturbances out there with explosive eruptions. On the other hand, the basalt field itself is principally created not by Vesuvius type explosive eruptions, but instead kind of a bubbling liquid flow. Much of it up here in Syria at Jebel Harab, but also other volcanoes in the region. It's a hyper-arid area. This 50 millimeter rainfall isohit includes Wasad pools over here and the Wadi Qaddafi over here. But you can see that in the Black Desert, that never was very tropical. But going back to Bernie Venegar's charts of rainfall, we can suggest that there may have been a 60 millimeter increase in local precipitation out here in the desert. So that instead of 50 centimeters per year, it may have been 80 or 160 or 240. And here we're on the, well, especially up here near the Syrian border, we're on the verge of agriculture. And perhaps even down here in the hyper-arid areas today, there may have been the occasional possibility that people could stay in one place and actually grow, not necessarily wheat and barley, but other local desert materials that could be converted into some kind of dietary staple. Going out there today, it is not the most inviting place. It's during the rainy season, one can see a very thin film of vegetation showing up, but once the rain stops, and even in February, that vegetation, that greenery dries out very quickly. And one of the problems with all of this is all, you know, clastic material is difficult to cross. The ability to move from one side or one end of the Black Desert certainly depended on chance, where there might have been openings that could be used to move from one part of the desert or from one part of the western area off eastwards into Iraq. Bernd Müller-Neuhof is trying to establish some kinds of possible routes of communication. So we're going to start by looking at the mesas, the ones that were in that picture at the beginning, and eventually we'll end up at Wasad Pools. The mesas are down the southwestern part of the Black Desert, and Wasad Pools is another 60 kilometers eastwards to the eastern edge of the Black Desert. This is a Google map of the mesas. There are a lot of mesas out there, but the ones that really make a big difference to our research are these right along what's called the Wadi Qaddafi. The Wadi Qaddafi actually comes in from 3 separate Wadi Qaddafis. They all join up here at the Qaddafi, which would have been a seasonal lake virtually, with higher precipitation rates. And one of the nice things about this is that the Wadi itself and all of the resources on the plateau outside made it possible for people to stay there, not just as pastoralists on a sort of very temporary basis, seasonal basis, but even at times, perhaps all year round. I'll come back to that later. So we have done, well, yeah, more than 20 mesas right along the 5 kilometers of Wadi Qaddafi, more than 800 structures that are not animal enclosures. Now, certainly these are not all contemporaneous, although when we look at some of the distribution of those 800, a lot of them could be contemporaneous. Here is Mesa 7, and around Mesa 7 and between Mesa 6 and Mesa 7, 278 structures, all of them almost identical in terms of their construction techniques and forms. Again, it boggles the mind to think that we might have, let's say, 50 families or even 75 families living out there simultaneously on a seasonal basis, probably. But what they are relying on is not so much a stable source of food in terms of vegetational material, but instead they're relying on hunting of gazelle that would have provided an enormous amount of food for these people. So 278 around Mesa 7, about 80 around the base of Mesa 5, and across the Wadi down at the bottom of the picture, another 44 around Mesa 8. So just in that one place alone, more than 400 structures. This is Mesa 4, also known as Maitland's Mesa, which was photographed by a pilot in the Royal Air Mail back in 1927, or published anyway. All of the material you see up here is kind of exciting, but it has nothing to do with the Neolithic. These are probably all early Bronze Age gardens that are naturally irrigated by rain falling on this highest part of the summit and then dribbling down into these walled garden plots. But what drew our attention, I might also point out, this is a tower tomb, and leading from that tower tomb is a line of 54 cenotaphs, empty constructions honoring whoever may have been buried. Now, according to Ackermans, this is probably an Iron Age, although what part of the Iron Age is difficult to say, an Iron Age tomb, but to have 54 visits, probably on an annual basis, indicates that this person probably had considerable influence that lasted more than 50 years after he died. We were drawn back in 2008 to the south slope here, because there were a lot of constructions that reminded us of Ofer Bar Yosef's work down in Sinai on Noamis. And for a couple of years, we thought we were working in Noamis areas, but it turned out that's not true. There's a variety of structures down here on the south slope, and we selected SS11 out of whatever it was, 22, 23 structures for excavation. The important part, let me go back on that a little bit. You'll notice that this little red dot, that's the structure SS11. It's attached to a circular corral. All of these buildings here have huts and corrals. And when we excavated, this really is a hut. You can't call it a house. It's only about 3 meters by 2 meters in size, and the roof was probably fairly low. There was a standing stone in the middle here, but it was less than 1 meter high, which meant if that was supporting a roof, you were probably only crawling on the ground. The interesting aspect here was there were doorways that led from outside. This is, oops, no, I don't have that doorway. There's a doorway here that's only about 60 centimeters high. There's another one here that's about 60 centimeters high. That's this one right here. So they could enter into their hut and then go directly into their corral where they kept their sheep and goats probably. There's also a small structure sort of added to the small hut, and that's this. It's a corbelled structure. There's a standing stone here to hold the ceiling, and this is the doorway leading into that structure here. But in any event, in that season, we were lucky enough to have found a few C14 or radiocarbon samples. One of them dated to 5400, which is getting very close to the end of the Neolithic altogether. We have several more radiocarbon dates online right now, waiting for the assay. This is that area again around SS11. And one of the things we noticed was that higher up on the slope, we had a whole bunch of buildings that were, again, corbelled construction, but they were not associated with animal enclosures here. Those are the triangular ones. And so we never did excavate. Well, we did excavate one of these, but we didn't end up with any radiocarbon samples. But we think that probably this group indicates an earlier late Neolithic presence here, and that the rest of the triangles are sort of final Neolithic. Moving up towards the north from Mesa number 4, we come to Mesa 7, Mesa 6, Mesa 9. And this, remember, has 278 structures all around the Mesa 7. They're not distributed randomly. They seem to appear in clusters of anywhere from 4 to 6 structures each, maybe even more than 6 structures in some cases. And at first glance, it would seem to me to suggest that these clusters actually represent extended families, that we have grandpa and grandma and a bunch of married sons and daughters, all acting as an economic unit with their own sheep and gazelle, but also acting as a labor force for something we'll get back to in a little while. SS1 is a circular structure that seems to have gone through several phases. One of the interesting things is it appears that the original building was circular with this wall, and then later on they constructed an interior wall of not slabs laid horizontally, but vertically on end. And we see that sort of style or that scheme very often on the south slope. We also see just circular wall structures without those vertical slabs at all. There are at least 4 phases. It begins with the earliest phase is down onto scoured bedrock, limestone bedrock. It has 3 standing stones, or again, large stones set on end. There's a central pillar and 2 at either side. There is a doorway that goes down a series of steps from the exterior all the way down to the interior. And we'll look at that again. Altogether, from all of the phases that we excavated, there were only 135 arrowheads. And you say only 135. Yeah, well, wait until we get to some other excavation. We only have C14 dates for phase 2 out of phase 1, 2, 3, 4. But again, we still have several samples waiting for analysis. COVID has a lot to answer for. Now I put up summer solstice for a reason here. Oh, wait a minute. Went the wrong way. No, I didn't. Sorry, apologies. Here's that stairway that goes down 1 step, 2, 3, 4 steps to a landing step, and then another step down to the actual floor. Inside, I think I'm missing a slide here. If I go back again to this, maybe you can see some very light, dark shadows. These are stakes that were put in, used for measuring. You'll notice those stakes parallel the orientation of that doorway. This photograph was taken on June 21st, 2014. That's a summer solstice date. Was that important for these people, or is this only some kind of coincidence? I don't know. Wait until later on. On the interior, gypsum plaster was used at least periodically or sporadically. We have a large oval basin that was made of gypsum plaster, and it was not very deep, probably only 5 or 6 centimeters deep. But after a bunch of dirt had accumulated, once that was abandoned, they put another gypsum plaster basin in the same area, kind of nested the new one. And if you look closely, you can probably see some fingerprints or some finger movement when applying that. Another important element here, at least looking at the variability of function and of design, is this exposed circular feature. filled with just normal dirt and rocks and stuff. But once it was excavated, it turned out to be a silo about 32 centimeters deep and 44 centimeters in diameter. It was also lined with plaster, but now we run into a problem that it doesn't look like gypsum plaster. It has characteristics of lime plaster. It doesn't have characteristics of gypsum plaster. So where are they making lime? That's a good question. From the soil samples in here, we found nothing to indicate what had been stored in here, or if any organics have been stored at all. On the eastern half, where that doorway is coming in, it certainly seems to be an industrial zone. 8 fire pits, some of them very deep, and an awful lot of ash and whatever. I mean, it's obvious that we can get another 10 C14 days out of this, but we're not going to be doing that. But this certainly suggests that the eastern half was not a place to sleep. If we look at the distribution of those those hearths, it suggests that the structure had 2 halves. And it also suggests that this area may have been, well, let me start that over again. Looking at the flints, the flint artifacts, those from this area were almost always totally patinated. Whereas in this area, very little patination on the flint artifacts, suggesting that this may have been roofed in one way or another. Here again, this central pillar is only about 1 meter high. So this is not roofed over from standing stone to standing stone. I think they may have a completely different way of sort of providing roofing. But this brings to mind, with that much industrial activity, was this a house at all? Or is this a working station? Now, I already talked about it, sorry. Now, looking back at the clustering of structures out there, this is SS1. This is the one we excavated. But there's also these that are very close. There are 2 more just below the bottom of this image. And in 2015, this was excavated in 2000. This was excavated in 15 and 16. We came back in 2017, and there was an awful lot of looting. This happens all the time, every year. But this is SS3, one of those that's very close to that working station. And one of the things you can see, there are walls here. But measuring these things, it was like that hut that we had attached to an animal enclosure. It's 3 meters long and about 2.5 meters wide. And SS6, same thing again. These look like dormitory rooms, if you will, that people weren't living in SS1. They were only doing all of the heavy work or the heavy industry they had to do, and sleeping in here perhaps at night. We haven't been back. I would love to be able just to go through the looters' back dirt, but it just hasn't been possible. So 135 arrowheads, and what we've gone through is probably occupation that lasts, sporadically over, let's say, 55, 65 years. So they're not doing an awful lot of hunting, or at least the material that is associated with hunting hasn't ended up in that workplace, suggesting perhaps that the butchering is taking place outside. This is, if you take it over 65 years, that's two arrowheads a year. That's kind of unlikely. Again, strengthening the interpretation that SS1 is actually a workplace is that from SS1, 191 drills in the first two layers. And beads are also very popular. Both marine shells here, Danielle, that's for you, but also a bunch of mineral materials as well. A surprising aspect in the flotation of one of those pits, one of those fire hearths, was that part of a burned fig showed up. And granted, somebody may have brought a fig all the way from Ain Ghazal on a visit to Grandpa, but it suggests that there are areas perhaps around that dry lake bed up in the north, where even fruit trees were able to survive for a long time. By the way, this is taken looking towards the west, and you can see one of the features of the desert out there is this so-called wheel construction. Nobody really knows what that wheel was used for. It might be associated with pastoralism. So let's move over to Wasad pools. Wasad is named after the Wadi Wasad, which follows this area from a plateau down in the lower left hand here, along a plateau for about 1.5 kilometers, ending up into another dry lake bed or a playa. We have excavated 4 sites. What I haven't put here is that we excavated a tower tomb here that had been looted, and we found late Neolithic material at the bottom of the tower tomb, but it was in very questionable context here. But W400, W66, and W80, we've excavated almost completely, and we're going back to finish 80 and 400 this summer. As was the case in the Wadi Qaddafi, settlements seem to cluster, or buildings seem to cluster. And in fact, if we look at this area here, not only do structures cluster, but also burials. This is a burial cluster number 2, burial cluster number 1 here. And then we have sort of normal building clusters. And that is repeated, again, very likely these clusters are not extremely overlapping in time. But again, the distribution of clusters suggests the potential that we're looking at extended families who are here for a certain amount of time, certainly enough time that it was worthwhile constructing very durable housing. Coming back to the Wadi Wasad, there are 9 and perhaps even more. It gets very confusing in this area. 9 pools. Most of them are artificial. Number 1 is natural, number 2 is natural, number 3 may be natural, but it looks like they may have put a barrage in here. 4, 5, and 6 are not natural, 7 and 8 probably are. When we first arrived in 2011, and we came across kind of a rise and down towards our camp, this is our camp here, we were surprised to find pool number 1 was full almost to the brim. And by doing our measurements, that pool held a minimum of 2,000 cubic meters of water. That's a lot of water. And in fact, this is a prime target for Bedouin water trucks today. As soon as there's water, trucks are coming in and sucking it up. Beside pool number 9 also has an awful lot here, but we weren't early enough because these pools had already been drained more or less by Bedouin trucks. The earliest structure at Wasad Pools we excavated last year, W400, it's separated way off to the north of the site, but we have a very substantial building here. It's about 4 meters by, well, almost 4 by 5 meters perhaps. Very little in terms of interior features, although it seems we have some bays or some apses at work in here. This was occupied, again, sporadically over at least 2 or 3 phases, the earliest one of which gave us a PPNC date of 6970 Cal BCE. But a later phase up here was into the early 6th millennium. Now, this house, if that's what it is connected at least tangentially to a corral that was built to hold probably sheep and goats on a daily basis or whatever was the schedule. And this forms part of a hut and pen structure that is repeated over and over, especially in this northern part of the site. I suspect most of that sort of corral activity, building and using, is in the later part of the late Neolithic. W66 is a standalone site, no animal enclosures. Here's an excavation, a drone shot, a kite shot of our excavations there. It's about 4.5 meters in diameter. It's adjacent to a stone platform built simply of flat basalt stones. Its function is unknown. We excavated into it, didn't find anything particularly exciting. This may have simply been a platform for storing material. The interior is a little more exciting. There's an apse on the western end. In front of the apse is either an enormous block of basalt, which would have been very difficult to move, or it is bedrock. To the east of that, in the floor, is a plaster basin about 44 centimeters in diameter and about 10 centimeters deep. And it's part of the gypsum plaster that extended all across the entire floor. There's another central stone, another central pillar, but it's pretty obvious that the distance between this pillar and any of the walls was too great to have a roof, a corbelled roof over it. Once again, this is about 1 meter high, and you would have to be crawling on your knees. That apse was plastered with gypsum plaster a minimum of 4 times, with sometimes substantial amounts of dirt that accumulated between the plastering episodes. This is viewed in the opposite direction. Before we were looking, towards the east. Here we're looking back towards the west. There's that central pillar again. There is a standing stone here, or at least a stone on end, which has, in my opinion, anthropomorphic contours. And you might not like that interpretation, but we've got one figurine that tends to reproduce that sort of image. You can see the effect of corbelling here. There's a deep niche in here. In that niche, we found 11 basalt pounders, pestles, that ranged in length from about 15 centimeters up to around 25 centimeters in length. Again, it suggests perhaps that this house was not occupied all year round. It could have been, but they would store their grinding material in this niche for when they returned later on in a different season or even a different generation. So here's the plan view, again, the apse, the basalt block, the plaster basin, central pillar, and the niche down in here. Now, these are the only two figurines that we've recovered from the Black Desert at all, period. And it looks like we might have a dog, or you can make up whatever you want, I guess. Although we do have domesticated dogs in the bone inventory out there. And this is the other sort of what I consider to be a figurine. And it has certain similarities to that standing stone I pointed out before. The hunting focus is clearly indicated by an enormous number of arrowheads, an awful lot of sort of so-called late Neolithic arrowheads, especially parsa points, the occasional biblos or Nitzanim point, but mostly the big majority are these transverse arrowheads. Moving about 35 meters to the northeast, we come to W80, which we have been working on now for 5 years. Very complex, very difficult to interpret because it's undergone an awful lot of change over time. We again have a central standing stone, a pillar, a meter high. We have another meter high standing stone to the west of it. We think there probably was one here to the east, but it's not there anymore. There's a very broad 2-meter wide doorway or entry here. You can see that there was an original wall, circular structure, which was then changed by adding sort of a central arc here, reducing the diameter of the building. There's the standing stone on one side of the doorway, and on the other, another standing stone in the wall, in the new wall, another standing stone, 2 standing stones on either side of a low doorway here that goes from the interior into a circular adjunct, which we call the porch, although I don't know why we call it the porch. Another standing stone here, which with H, this is I, and H form part of an apse again. And then M over here is a window. And it's got 2 vertical slabs and a window sill. We'll take a look at that again in a little more detail. So here we're looking to the southeast, here we're looking to the east-southeast. And you can see, here's that porch again, nice and circular. It's got a circular installation here of basalt slabs, small slabs set on edge and creating a circle in a circle. There's a western forecourt that was set up by putting basalt slabs on edge. You can see the standing of the wall here. But that wall was breached by a later group of people. So we have this U shape, which is facing northwest, which we call unidentified installation. And then down here, you can see perhaps we have a U shape here with a standing stone in the middle of it. And this is pointing towards the southwest. We have, again, probably 4 major habitations here, going again from the very end of the PPNC up through probably into the later part of the late Neolithic. Again, we've got more C14 dates in the lab, and we're just holding our breath until it comes out. This is an earlier stopping point for us back in 2015. You can see that app's a lot better here now. You can see the western forecourt, part of the porch here. But now one of the major differences, you can see there's been a closing. This is that 2-meter doorway here, but they've blocked it up until there's only about an entrance of 60 centimeters wide. And A connects with D, connects with M. Here's that window I mentioned, right here with the sill and the 2 uprights. And this was photographed, not a very good one because I'm not a photographer, but you can see that there's an alignment with that window and this new narrow doorway taken on 26 June 2014. Here again, I suspect, that's all it is. There is a suspicion this may be associated with the summer solstice. On the other hand, what would the solstice mean to these people? That I don't know. 823 arrowheads. I mean, this was the center of butchering. So here again, I'm suggesting this is not a house. This is a place where people did work. It's 8 meters in diameter. Well, it was 8 meters, and then with that new wall put on the inside, it went down to 7 meters in diameter. The arrowheads are 83% of them are transverse arrowheads, and the rest are these normal sort of late Neolithic arrowheads. 223 knives. Again, very likely, substantially supporting an interpretation that this was a butchering station. But it's not just a butchering station, because we also found enormous meter diameter grinding stones with cup holes, for which they would have used a lot of those pestles. Beautiful flint work, pressure flaking. These guys were excellent. This isn't as easy to see on this kind of screen as it is with the original photograph. But here again, we're looking at that narrow doorway and the apse. When we had came to the last week of excavation in 2014, we decided to put in a 1-meter probe here to see what we're pretty sure we hadn't reached the floor. So we put in a probe to see where the floor was. And perhaps you can see a difference in the color between H at the bottom of that probe and the silt that we had reached as we were excavating the main structure. The fill inside came down on a floor that was composed of this red, gritty, permeable soil, bright red. And not only under W80, which we were just looking at, but also on that other structure we excavated, W66. It is clear that this was the original landscape, or at least the original soil cover. If we reconstruct what situation was at 6500 BC, they had built a structure on top of this red soil that would support vegetation. But after 5600 BC or whatever it was, erosion set in, removed all of that red soil, and the only place that is preserved are under the buildings. And that is very important because all of that erosion of that red soil from these two sites anyway, went down into Wadi Qaddafi, into that playa. Now, our hydrologist was doing coring all over the place where these playas were. There was a hole that was excavated by bulldozers to trap water for Bedouin herders. And in that section of that bulldozer hole was a layer of about 20 centimeters of, no, not that much, 15 centimeters of red, gritty, permeable soil. So a pollen sample, or a lot of pollen samples were taken, and very surprising results. Lemna is duckweed, and I don't know how many of you have been out looking at ponds in the summertime, but the entire surface usually is covered with these tiny little things here. And obviously, in order for lemna to reproduce, water has to be standing water in the Black Desert. Pollen also showed that Typha latifolia was also present in impressive amounts. These cattails or bulrushes were useful for a variety of purposes. First of all, the roots are very starchy and could have been dried, ground up, and producing a flour that could have been used to make bread, arrow shafts, mats, baskets, whatever. Also, most of the pollen we had was Poaceae, what used to be called graminy, including Juncus, which again, very useful for weaving. And although it couldn't be identified specifically, species specifically, it is very likely there were Phragmites reeds. This is a photograph of the oasis at Azra, and there were incredibly dense stands of Phragmites out there. Phragmites is enormously useful for architectural purposes and also for hunting. But if you're going to be making spears or arrow shafts, you have to get rid of these joints. And we found at least 3 shaft straighteners. Typha and Juncus don't require any kind of straighteners, but Phragmites does. This is the grass pollen. It looks the same for everything. Also, in terms of pollen, oak pollen and charcoal. That's not a problem. Now, the species of oak is Quercus caliprinus, which is the area's, the Near East's most prodigious producers of acorns. They were probably using acorns to make acorn bread. These cup holes here fits in very nicely with the model from the southern coast of California, where Native American tribes would move the entire village to the oak trees and create then flour from dried acorns, and then move back into the hills and the mountains. So I think this fits a very nice pattern of a stable supply of food. Axes, groundstone axes, a variety of others. This one's been abused quite a bit. Now, 7 to 8 meters across that main room. Was it roofed? Probably not, or at least it wasn't roofed on the basis of using these standing stones to support. On the other hand, if Phragmites was there at those playas, the marsh Arabs show what can be done with Phragmites. I mean, this guy probably weighs 140 or 130 pounds, but he's standing on reeds. And in fact, when you make cathedrals like this, why aren't the late Neolithic people doing the same thing? It's very lightweight material, but it's also very strong. comparing the two areas, the Wadi Qaddafi and the Wisad areas, looking at selected tool types. There, the percentages of tools vary quite a bit in some cases, but a lot of the tool types don't really show any meaningful distinctions. But if we look at arrowheads or projectile points, we can see that both at W400 and SS1 in the Wadi Qaddafi, we're not relying on going out to getting hunting. Although again, butchering may have been taking place outside the structure. Burins, my God, what the heck is going on here with these burins? At SS1, the burins probably weren't used as burins per se. They were probably cores to produce all of those amazing drills that turned up in the excavation. Scrapers, if you're cleaning hides, if that's what they're used for, the hides were not as important, at least in the interior of W80 or W66, compared to SS1 with Wadi Qaddafi. Notches, again, I don't know what notches are used for, but the people at W400 and SS1 didn't care for them. Denticulates. The denticulates from Wisad aren't simply these serrated blades and flakes. They are saws. I mean, these things look like an electric saw that a carpenter would use. Very, very jagged and very, very wicked. And it might be that they are using these denticulates for cutting reeds without destroying the integrity of the reeds. Drills, here's that industrial output from W400. Wedges, again, probably wedges, which are these very small pieces of flint, usually fractured blades and bladelets that have extreme battering on opposed edges or opposed sides, edges, opposed ends or opposed edges, or both, battering on all of it. And again, probably would have been useful for splitting reeds in order to make mats or whatever they're going to be using that for. And knives, W80, inside that building, a lot of butchering going. Wait a minute, there's something wrong there. It can't be 58%. It's probably 8.7. It's probably a typo here. Anyway, and here again, we can see the differences in arrowhead types. Transverse arrowheads dominating like mad. In Wisad, Aparsa points, the favorite in SS1, and Badia points, which is something that was first described by Allison Betts. It's a fairly heavy and maybe not an arrowhead, but perhaps either a dart point or a spear point. So this brings up the question of why is there a large population? What draws people out there during the 6th millennium? Well, at Wisad pools anyway, there are walls going all over the place, and they're very jagged, zigzag sawtooth types of things, which Allison Betts has suggested is the grandparent of kites, these desert kites. And here, well, it's kind of a small, maybe you can see one of these going across the northeastern corner of Wisad pools. We have 3 of these sawtooth things at Wisad pools on the site. But desert kites themselves are numerous, 1,440 in Jordan alone. And you can add all the rest of them from Syria and Saudi Arabia to that too. Star-shaped kites are probably a little late in the development, or at least they're not the earliest forms of kites. But these guiding arms that go off sometimes up to 10 kilometers long, sort of funneling in herds of gazelles that were stampeded by using dogs to chase them. They come up against the guiding walls and turn immediately to follow the walls until they enter the trap. This is blocked off, and then it's pandemonium. Either they're shooting the gazelle, or in some of the kites, these circular things here were pits that were more than 2 meters deep, where gazelle would fall, couldn't get back out again, and you would just have a gory time of shooting. In the Mossad area, we have 77 kites, all within a radius of 5 hours of walking. And those, also at Wadi Qaddafi, 8 of them in the wadi itself, although one of them goes up on top. I don't know if you can see that. Here's a guiding wall, here's a guiding wall, and there's the kite right there at the cliff. This is eroded. Now, one of the reasons there are so many people out there is kites don't grow on the surface by themselves. They have to be built. And if you're going to be building 1,440 kites, you're going to have an awful lot of people build them. It's worthwhile putting in a lot of labor because of the returns you get. So if you're out there and if you understand how you might invent a new way of hunting, you tell people around there, maybe some relatives who didn't quite make it out as far as Wadi Qaddafi, that if you invest your family into building these kites, you're going to get a return so big in terms of food, in terms of animal hides. Remember, Ofer was suggesting that hides may have been a valuable trade item with the Western agricultural areas. So there are a lot of people out there because it could be that large population could be supported by all of the meat that's coming off and by the trade, but you also needed a large population in order to set up that sort of situation. One other thing about something just went through my mind and I forgot it. In any event, there are so many things out there that still look for a lot of research. And I've just gotten too old. I can't sleep on the ground anymore. Well, that's not true. I can sleep on the ground. I just can't stand up from the ground. But hopefully, not only will Alan and Alex and York and Chad continue out here for the next 20 years, but other people will also kind of step in and contribute to the research. So thank you very much.
Thank you for this very, very interesting talk. I learned a lot about this desert. I'm waiting for people to raise their hands or write in the chat if you have any questions. And maybe until it will start happening, I have a few questions, so I will start off. You talked just now about the possibility that hide was a trade item, right?
Yeah.
So I was wondering, what do you see in the material culture that can show these connections, maybe, that is beyond the local? Do you have any raw material elements that are beyond the local?
Well, I mean, we have some indications of trade with the West. We have a beautiful handle of a Yarmoukhian pot with incised herringbone incision stuff. Sawtooth Qaddafi has identified more than 30 Yarmoukhian potsherds at W80. But other than that, no, we haven't really seen an awful lot of material coming east from the trading partners. Oh, one of the things I wanted to skip my mind there for a little bit. Labu Aziza and his group, Mohammed Tarauna and Remy Kaisa, excavated a camp not adjacent to, but very close to a kite down in the southern Hamad, in the limestone platform by Jaffa. And in one of in the pit where all of the butchered bones and stuff from gazelles that had been captured in that kite had a minimum number of individuals of 148 gazelles. I looked up the average weight of a gazelle. That's more than a ton of meat, not just the meat, not the bones. And I couldn't find an amount for how much a gazelle hide weighs. But what do you do with a ton of meat? What do you do with that, say, 400 kilograms of skin? How many people are you going to move all of that meat to, or slog these hides? Again, the large population is available, not only produce all of that stuff by building kites, but the large population can also help harvest it. No doubt they're drying the meat. That gets rid of a lot of the weight, but you're still going to have people that might face carrying 55 kilos of meat from all of those animals you just butchered. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, this is speculative. We don't know how much trade there was outside of these communities to the west or to the east, for that matter. They might also be moving stuff up into Iraq. I don't know. I made that up. But in any event, yeah.
Thank you. Cheryl, you had a question?
Gary almost took my question. He got very
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, of course, of Weil's material out at Hashabia there, and all the gazelle, and those installations that you have, these really kind of industrial hearths with these huge whacking, looks like these upright stones that are really kind of pressed into the ground. They have something similar at Hashabia, quite a few of those. So. Yeah, they were all in this kind of the exterior area rather than the interior, but that's where all of these gazelle deposits, these really thickly laid down layers of gazelle bones were found. You haven't found anything like that in the exterior areas yet, have you?
No. We've been working rather slowly, as it turns out, mainly because of logistics and stuff. Dying when the temperatures get up to 44. There are plenty of places around, for example, W80, that 8-meter diameter building, or even around SS1 in Wadi Qaddafi, that we haven't sampled. For one thing, I'm pretty sure we're looking at workstations, for grinding grain or whatever it is, or whatever, because all of the bones that came out of W80 from butchering, you want to sleep on those at night? I don't think so. I mean, it must be kind of bloody and kind of smelly and attracting an awful lot of vermin. So I suspect, we've got other loci where they're doing also bad stuff, Again, scraping hides, I don't know what that's going to bring in, but a lot of insects or something. So like those small huts that were looted at SS1 and Wadi Qaddafi, I think that's a more likely situation for where the family members are sleeping.
Thank you, Gary.
Any other questions? Yes, Anna.
Hi, Gary. Thank you.
Anna.
It was really fascinating. And I got a little bit, it's my fault, I got a little bit confused. So excuse me if it's a stupid question, but most of the sites that you were showing show a sequence of, let's say, PPNC up to late Neolithic, all through. Now, do you have anything that precedes the PPNC or the, let's say, PPNB maybe? And do you have any early Chalcolithic? Because it looks like a chunk of time that it was very special and particular. So do you have something before and after?
We, at Wasad Pools, we've got a Luther pit that's late PPNB. But there's very little substantial material, oh, pardon me, from the PPNB, late PPNB. We tend to find small activity areas, like somebody has just squatted down and put out 7 or 8 blades, converted them into whatever, knives or something, and then left. These are temporary, you can measure them in hours rather than days. And that seems to have been the late 8th millennium would have been very temporary, very small groups, maybe because they didn't have dogs with them. I don't know what the situation is. It's not until the PPNC, when the megasites collapsed, that we begin to see suddenly an increase in population out there, beginning even with the material from Wadi Qaddafi. There's not a lot of people in Wadi Qaddafi, but they are moving eastward during the PPNC. You asked the second question too.
I just wanted to know whether you have something which continues, from the late Neolithic into the Chalcolithic, sort of.
Yeah, we do have these final phases that probably are verging on the Chalcolithic. The trouble is, the late Neolithic starts to merge into the Chalcolithic in terms of typologies in the desert. These are hunter groups. They aren't farmers, and they're not doing whatever's going on in the Jordan Valley or something. If there is a Chalcolithic, it is going to look very, very much like the late Neolithic, I think. But secondly, we have some burials out there. At Wasad Pools, we've got a lot of early bronze stuff. Not so much, it's mostly graves. There are 2 very likely Chalcolithic graves out there, very similar to Kulban Benimura, for example, with these erect structures. So there probably are Chalcolithic people out there. We are getting an awful lot of the normal Chalcolithic tabular scrapers.
I said whether you have the tabular scrapers.
Yeah, we had one pot from that Kulban Benimura-like thing that I couldn't find parallels anywhere. It had kind of little drip lines along the edge, but the shape was completely different than everything I went through. So I finally said it's probably Chalcolithic early bronze. Yeah.
Thanks, Gary.
Yeah.
I'll come back to you if there will be no other questions. I don't want to monopolize you.
Yes, same here. So I think, Trevor, you have a question.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Gary. It was great to be taken out there without the temperatures. It was
absolutely
blissful. There's 2 or 3 things that puzzle me. One is my ignorance. Transverse arrowheads, and you emphasized how many there were. where else do you find those? I say I'm ignorant, but they came as a surprise to me. So that's one thing. And then such a great big date range. I remember I made a note, W400. There's over a millennium date range from your, okay, you've only got 2 radiocarbon dates at the moment, but
Yeah.
spread over a millennium. Do you have any cultural change that suggests that there's over that period that there's things going on? And then the third thing was those sites are a long way east of anywhere where there would be, if you like, a normal late Neolithic population who would be receiving the hides or the dried meats. Yeah. And that reminded me suddenly of the Bagia and Steiner Kirkbride site, which again, surely is early 6th millennium BC, Proto-Hasuna, yeah? And again, it's quite clearly, factory level production at some very considerable distance. Looks like we've got something happening in the late Neolithic, which is completely unsuspected.
Yeah, in terms of moving, in terms of trade connections, if there is a market for meat and hides or whatever it is these people are getting out there in this kite industry, I looked at the distance from Wadi Qaddafi, no, from Wasad Pools, and looked at the distribution of the playas, the dry lake beds. And if you're driving a herd of sheep or whatever animals, maybe some goats too, and are able to make, I think, 20 kilometers a day with hides on top of the back of sheep. And there are pack sheep even today in different parts of the world, or pack goats, as well as people carrying a little backpack themselves. You could probably take quite a bit of material with just 40 or 50 people. It's sort of like, going on summer break or something. And make it all the way to Ain-Ghazal in 11 days.
Wow.
So it's not out of the realm of possibility. But they may have been going only as far as Zarqa, or they might have been going only as far as some site we haven't found that is a sort of a center of distribution, continued distribution. For the long range of dates at W400, yes, that doesn't make any sense to me either. But W400 kind of stands out by itself because it's the only PPNC site we've excavated. The PPNC structure may have only been occupied for a generation, if that much. And that it was when somebody came along and wanted to make a corral for their sheep and goats. They found that hut still standing, fairly clean. It may have simply been reused. But like, as you say, we have to really wait for, we've got at least 2 more samples that I hope will be out before June even. And what was the first one you mentioned?
Transverse arrowheads.
Transverse arrowheads. I had never run into transverse arrowheads at all until we got out there. But Alison Betts had written up quite a bit about transverse arrowheads on her surveys and excavations. So I wasn't surprised that we had so many out there. There are no transverse arrowheads that I know of in the farming areas in the western part of Israel and Jordan.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, these arrowheads are razor sharp. A lot of them are about the length and width of your thumbnail, or even smaller. And if you're not using reeds, phragmites, as the arrow shaft, you can still use those typha latifolia shafts. And as long as you've got a great bow, you can be killing those trapped giraffes, gazelles just hand over fist. So that's a very effective sort of mass slaughter tool. And if you're carrying shafts of Typha latifolia, which is almost, it doesn't weigh anything, and you've got, let's say 25 arrows per person, and you've got 20 people shooting there, boy, you can bring down an awful lot of gazelle quickly. And then you face the problem of getting that meat and hide back to your home base.
Thank you very much,
Okay.
Gary. Bill Finlayson knows about transverse arrowheads, but from somewhere rather different.
Yeah. So, Bill, your question.
I wasn't going to say anything about transverse arrowheads, but yes, often used for bird hunting, I think, aren't they? Anyway, yeah, chronology, which to me sort of seems quite key, isn't it? And some of the other questions were about chronology, because it's this thing, isn't it? If you've got a relationship between people hunting out in the east and farmers in the west, you know, and we know that there's an abandonment of the large population and so on in the west, it'd be nice to be able to tie it together a bit closer in some ways. But one particular thing was the Sawtooth Walls and Alison Bett's idea that these were early. But as we know from Hashabir and Wiles dates now, I think it's the star-shaped, possibly late kites, seem to go back to PPNC, possibly even late PPNB.
Yeah.
And so you don't, as yet at least, have any real settlement that goes with them if they're early. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about, is this a chronology or is it just something else? And that's an idea that we should maybe abandon. And the other thing, just you raised the hunting with dogs, again, coming in quite late where you are, compared, for example, the PPNA dates that Lisa Yeomans and Tobias Richter have now got up at Shebeka, where they're arguing for large numbers of dogs being used in hunting. And again, is that just because you've got dogs going back as early as you've got settlement, but you don't, you know, there's something happening earlier, maybe with Sawtooth Walls and dog hunting and so on, that you're just not picking up because you haven't got, or as yet you haven't excavated any of the buildings that go back that far. I don't know what your thoughts on all of those issues are.
Well, I mean, dogs go all the way back to the middle PPNB, at least around Gazal. And you know, when you look at the Eastern Desert and what's been excavated out there by Allison or by us or by anybody else, there's not an awful lot of information about the species. Well, that's not true. Louise, that's not true. Dogs are a good thing to have if you're a hunter. And you know, I'm not surprised that they're using dogs in hunting. In this case, not, you know, they're simply stampeding the gazelle, I think. And you feed them, you know, a third of a gazelle liver for all of their work. For those walls, I have no idea what they're for. I mean, as far as I know, Allison is not claiming this as a reality, that they precede kites. What their purpose is, I don't know. You know, we've got these strange walls cropping up all over the place. There's that Khat al-Shahid or whatever it is that goes on for 250 kilometers or 400 kilometers up into Syria from almost Aqaba. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, more research has to be done on doing OSL dating of those walls. And there's this huge gap between, you know, the Hamad just doesn't seem to be very interesting to an awful lot of prehistorians because it's a rather dull landscape today. But should we be looking for for this gap between the late PPNB and the late Neolithic in the Hamad to see if there's any transitional developments that go on. I know I would be a little, it's kind of boring to be out in the Hamad, to put it one way. And unless you've got some really lucrative donors for your project, I think there's probably a good chance you're not going to find an awful lot. But you can't say that because you won't know unless you try it. So there was something else you brought up too, and I've forgotten.
No, I guess it was just this whole question of trying to refine exactly that bit of the chronology, the early part, when if people are starting to provision Western agricultural settlements before they decline in size, then they ought to be out doing the hunting before the Western sites decline in size. As it is at the moment, you've almost got the population from the West moving east to feed the people in the West who have gone east, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, there's a situation in the history of the United States. In 1882 or 1881, whatever, I mean, it's in the 1880s, the federal government opened up a complete take it and it's yours in Oklahoma territory. And so you had all these people, you know, get your covered wagon, your horses, your cow, your children, or whatever. And on the 1st of June, go as far as you can and put your stake in the ground. And that is your 640-acre property. It's yours forever. Of course, it tended to anger the Native Americans living in Oklahoma, but in any event, there was a land rush. People were roaring out there. So, I mean, it's, you know, kind of making this up, but it's not impossible that as the stresses of living in a megasite, a late PPNB megasite, were getting worse and worse and worse, there were people who had already been going out to the Eastern Desert and telling them, just put your stake in a kite and you'll live forever or whatever, you know, be very happy. I don't know, is there advertising at that time about how great, you know, California is? I don't know.
Thanks, Gary.
Okay. So we have, Anna has another question, and afterwards there are 2 questions on the chat, so I will read them out. So first, Anna, please.
Microphone.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to chip in about the conditions and that kind of environment. I was digging with Ofer quite a few of the Noami sites. And unless the archaeologist comes and digs and makes the native people curious about it, they can stand on forever and ever. I mean, it was amazing the way they were preserved because of the conditions. So I'm not amazed, or I'm not surprised, let's put it, that there were sites that you can see an occasional PPNC and a later late Neolithic coming in, because the buildings are there forever and ever. You know, if you check the Noamis and Guna, they were pristine when we arrived, and they date to, let's say, the first Egyptian dynasty, if not a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You know, thousands of years. So I think it's quite possible that the same structures were used over and over.
Yeah, I'm still not absolutely convinced that some of the buildings, especially in the Wadi Qaddafi, might in fact be a descendant of the Noamis. we have structures that don't fit the pattern of the late Neolithic. But we haven't excavated them because we were after the late Neolithic, and we didn't have a big enough team to go out and sample, the 13 different isolates. Yeah, I mean, there is so much space out there that looks empty, but it's filled with archaeology. And trying to arrange some kind of a plan to sample these things sufficiently is going to, it's going to be the National Aeronautics and Space Administration budget. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of frustrating, that's for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Now there's Sarah Yellowser is asking in the chat. She was wondering about the context of the beads and if there are any workshop or if some could be imported or exchange items and so forth.
In W400, where we found whatever that number was, 60% of the chipstone, 60% of the tools were bead drills. And I'm not talking about just awls, they're increasing the size of a whole wood or something. But these are bead drills. I think we had a total of 7 beads, which suggests that this is a bead industry for export, as far as I can see. But again, how do you tell that? If these are being exported to the West, they're probably getting an awful lot of beads from different areas. And how do you tell the W400 beads ending up in Yarmoukhian, whatever it is, Angazal or something? I don't know. That's a very good question, what the context of those beads were. And I have to say, I don't know. York Rowan excavated that site, and he would have a better handle on the context.
Okay, and there are 2 questions about additional material or other things from the site. Like Miravan is asking if there are any human bones burials, and Anna about pottery. So,
okay, for the burials,
these 2 elements?
For the burials, we have not a single human bone from anything we've excavated. And as for pottery, the only pottery we end up with is material that comes in from the West. Right? Like I said, Zidane has identified these 30 plus Yarmoukhian sherds, but the sherds are just that. I mean, it's, you find one piece of a pot and it's never going to fit with any other pottery, another potsherd from the same context. There's no pottery production that I can see any place in the Eastern Desert because the kind of clay either isn't there that you need, or the clay is so crummy that you're going to end up with dirt. One thing I might also add, though, if we're looking at that pollen analysis and the charcoal, there is certainly enough fuel. If you wanted to make a set of pots for your own house and you had the proper clay to do it, you could, I think, do that. Yeah, kind of like the primitive conditions of some of the Yarmoukhian pottery kilns. Yeah, but we just haven't found anything at all.
Okay. He was challenged and he wants to elaborate, right? About the beads?
Who?
Warren?
Ah, York, there you are.
York, yeah.
York,
He's not listening.
mute button.
I am listening, but in fact, I did not mean to raise my hand or anything like that. The beads need to be studied.
That's
I don't
it.
really
Now you
have
have to
anything
talk
useless.
about the context. Okay. So, anyone else? Any question? So I
Yeah,
think we will.
Yeah.
Danny. Yes.
Well, just I patiently waited towards the end, and I know it's already really getting late, which is why I didn't comment before, because it's just a comment, just some wild thoughts really about this fascinating talk. I had the fortune of working in Eritrea in 2006 and studying some shells from mid-Holocene sites over there near the Red Sea coast, which is a very, very arid area as well. And I mean, I was there in October when it's supposedly not so hot, and it was 45 degrees and like 90% humidity, just living hell. But I actually saw actual people living there nowadays in huts and so on, but which was fascinating in itself. But just this whole talk reminded me very much of what we had found over there in Eritrea. The dates are very similar. Of course, the climatic changes that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk are similar. I mean, I cannot now quickly do a so thorough comparison, but it's really thought-provoking that the adaptations of the people over there and in the Black Desert at the same time are very similar in the way that they use their environment. They rely on well-watered areas, even though it's so hot, and still there is water there at that period. And so just, this is my wild thought that I just wanted to share.
One of the things that struck me about the bead industry aspect of W400 is that if that animal enclosure was contemporaneous with that hut, it suggests that you might have a whole series of hours every day where you're not doing anything because your daughter or your son has got the sheep and goats out there looking for whatever it is, and you're sitting home getting fat on gazelle meat or something, and you're trying to make a little on the side. You're a bead person. What kind of satisfaction do you get out of making beads, unless there's some sort of economic element to it?
Is this a question?
Yeah.
Well, if you talk to Polly Wisner, who studied contemporaneous bead makers, she will tell you that, yeah, you do get satisfaction out of it because, well, when you make beads, especially for as a trade kind of commodity, if you want. I mean, it's too early in the Neolithic to call it a commodity, but if it's intended just to as something to trade to get something back for it, this is one thing. You'll do it in a very mechanistic way. On the other hand, if you're making beads with the intention of giving it to a specific person whom you like, whom you know, maybe a relative, maybe just a good friend who lives far away, but you're going to meet with them and you're making it specifically for them, then you have a special pleasure in making it. It feels much better and you'll be joking around while you make it.
I can understand that.
Huh?
I'm just too 21st century by now, I guess.
Well, So no, yeah, you like making beads, you know how to make beads, but there's a difference on how you feel about it. If you make it
Yeah.
for revenue, if you want to call it that, versus if you make it for social reasons.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we could wrap it up. And thank you again, Gary, for this wonderful talk. And maybe this is also the time to thank so much Gunesh and Miraban for this series, for the second series. I hope you're planning another one, because I don't know how I will look at the year and count the weeks without knowing that I have in my calendar the online Neolithic waiting for me. I'm expecting every talk. So thank you so much. And I'm sure I'm not saying it only from myself, but from all of the, yes, indeed.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. But I have to say, I'm so happy to see so many people that I haven't seen for such a long time. It's been a wonderful event for me as well. So thanks.